Yet another budget briefing. And we'll start with the land acknowledgement from Andre. If you could do the honors, that'd be great.
Absolutely, thank you. And our land acknowledgement reads as follows. On behalf of North Seattle College, we acknowledge that we occupy the traditional ancestry lands of the coastal Squamish peoples, specifically the Duwamish tribe, a people that are still here, continue to honor and bring light into their ancient heritage. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering, dialogue, learning, and Zoom space. We ask that you take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land, air, and water who are still here. Thank you, James.
Thank you. I love the Zoom space piece. Last week, you may recall, I started with a confession. I have another confession, which is that unfortunately, I was right last week. I didn't understand some of the codes properly in terms of the transfer codes with the district and everything. So some of the information I presented last week was wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify that, and I'm going to send out to all of you just that section, say this is the correct information, so you're not misled. I don't think it really changes anything materially, but you need to have the right information, so I'm going to get you that. And I'm going to ask Tony to take down the video, or Coral to take down the video, so that we'll redo that part so we don't have any misinformation out there. So no more fake news, right? That's the idea. So today, close the window so my lawnmower next door doesn't get it. Today we're going to talk about our self-support entities. So this isn't part of the operating budget, but self-support is important because it is part of our overall finances. Now, word on self-support, you might think that means not subsidized, right? And that's, of course, the logical inference. The fact is that some of our self-support operations are subsidized. They're subsidized by student government and to a lesser extent, or to a greater extent in some cases, by the college. And that is something that we've done over time. And one of the questions going forward here is, are we going to continue to that as a college? Can we continue to do that? Because what was once possible may no longer be possible. So when we talk about self-support, that means break even or better. In other words, the revenue exceeds or equals the expense. Now, the thing is, in any given year, things can vary. So we're looking at break even or better over the course of a cycle. So a cycle could be high enrollment to low enrollment, high unemployment to low unemployment, but over a business cycle. Because it's okay if over a period of several years, it breaks even, but it has a deficit year or two in there. So I'm going to start off with an illustration of that, which is continuing education. So over the last 5 years, or 6 years actually, you'll see this with all these. I'm going to show you a 6-year history. Continuing education has seen its revenues rise. So the green here are revenues. So it's been from 2014-15, they've steadily increased. And just this year, they started falling. And of course, they were in fact on track for another increase in revenue this year until COVID hit. From the expense side, you'll see that back in 2014-15, the expenses actually exceeded the revenues. But since then, it's been the other way around until this year again. So the little blue dots there represent the profit or loss. I use the word profit, net revenue or loss. And you'll see that in 14-15 and 15-16, there were small losses, but then started getting better. And just now in 19-20, they've seen a loss again. If you look at that over time, what you'll see is that back in 14-15, they were sort of below the line, so to speak. The purple is the cumulative net revenue. In 15-16, they were below the line again, but by 17-18, they're positive. They had a bit of a fund balance built up. 18, 19, that rose. And this year it's decreased a little bit again. So over the course of a cycle, continuing education has held its own, as it were. So I want to give you the sort of overall business context, as it were, of continuing education. First of all, it's two businesses. There's a personal enrichment courses, which are courses that are, like yoga, painting, ceramics, that type of thing. Also some personal finance courses and that type of thing. Courses that people take to enrich their lives and learn more. And that is what they call a low margin business. Like, we offer them for the community because it's a real value to people, but we just barely eke out a little more than our expenses when we offer those classes. But the adult family home program, that is something that's a requirement for people who want to run adult family homes. They have to take these courses and so on. And those courses are what we call high margin courses, so that the revenue we bring in for teaching a course like that significantly exceeds the cost of offering the course. So we're two very distinct businesses. And it's been sustainable across business cycles, as I illustrated for you earlier, and the fund balance is positive right now. Now, COVID-19, you saw in that graph, the revenue just dropped off a fair amount, but and it has affected the bottom line, but it's actually a fairly limited impact because the adult family home is where the revenue, the net really comes from. And that has been absolutely unaffected by COVID. So it's there's been a significant decline in the personal enrichment classes offerings, but the effect on the bottom line has been relatively small because there's just very low margin business.
Terrence, could you expand that to be full screen instead of in the edit mode? Folks are asking about maybe going into presentation mode.
Oh gosh, I thought I was.
Well, it's got a nice array of all the slides, but it's not as big as it probably ought to be.
Okay, let me.
There we go. There we go. There you go. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you for asking.
It's okay.
I got two screens set up, and I guess you saw the wrong one. I was looking for one that's big. So the options for continuing education are they can just trim their expenses a bit and ride it out, which has been proposed actually to the Budget Advisory Committee, and they're reviewing that. Another option is to outsource the operation and the risk associated with it, because there is some volatility. You can go up and down, and even though it's worked out over time, it doesn't necessarily work out. And that is what other schools have done. I think Cascadia, for example, where I once was, they outsourced their continuing education to Everett Community College. And another option is to close the program. So this is a case where over the cycle, it's been a break-even operation and serves the community. And it seems, based on the presentation done to the Budget Advisory Committee, that it's a fairly solid self-support program, even though it does have some risks associated with it. So food services is a different type of operation. And you'll see that what's been happening there from a revenue perspective is that from a peak of over $1 million in 2014-15, this year with COVID, it's less than $500,000. So there's been a real, very significant decline associated with COVID. And that is a steepening of a trend, but it is really a continuation of a trend. And we'll talk about why that is in a bit. From the expense side, food services has always had its expenses exceed its revenue. And so you see that as unchanged throughout, and they've followed a number of different strategies over time. So every year has seen losses, which have had to be subsidized by the college. And cumulatively, those amount to over $1 million over the last 6 years. So it is a very significant program from that perspective, and it's also a very significant part of the campus. So when you look at food service, our food service operation really dates back to the time when we had a culinary program. We have a full kitchen, and we make our own food, and we really value producing our own food, and people there do a great job. But that really ties back to that legacy. It's a very small scale, high cost operation. And what I mean by that is that we don't have high volume relative to other restaurant entities. So if you look at what they call the cost of goods as a percentage, what it costs us to put a dollar hamburger on there. I mean, obviously it's not a hamburger. To put a $1 item on the shelf, it costs us 45 cents to buy that item. A restaurant benchmark is 30 cents. So we have, just because we don't do much volume, relatively speaking, we have high costs that way. And from an operational perspective, we pay our people fairly and everything, but for a typical restaurant operation, we have very high labor costs. Now, part of that high labor cost is because student employment's been a real value. So we try to create opportunities for students to work. And so the staffing at the front counter and everything reflects that value. And in some ways, it's tied into the customer base. I'll talk about that in a minute. You saw that the volume used to be a lot higher. And that is because in the years before 2014-15, food services was losing money. And there was like, well, how do we get out of this situation? And the idea was to pursue an expansion strategy. It was to very aggressively pursue catering, create more meal options, that type of thing. And unfortunately, that didn't work ultimately. And so what's been happening over the last several years has been a retrenchment of sorts, where as staff have left and everything, the expense base, the cost base has been reduced quite a bit. But the problem has been that the revenues have been reducing even faster. And now with COVID-19, it's even worse, of course. So big part of the loss of revenue is international students. And the reason that's so important is because they're the primary clients. Half of the people buying food at our food services are international students. And part of the reason we have this staffing of, the student staffing value, a lot of the international students work there, sort of a symbiotic relationship. So as our international enrollment's collapsing, that is directly affecting food services. And unfortunately, it's hard to see how that recovers. Right now, people have been cut back to 50% time in food services just recently by a district edict. And our cost is $26,000 a month while we're closed, just based on staffing at that level. So outlook and options. Well, COVID is going to decide whether we can open or not, whether we can sell anything, whether we can have customers. And right now, it's looking like that's simply not going to happen until at least January and perhaps further. There's an international depression in terms of international students. While the Trump administration hasn't succeeded in throwing everybody out who's here, there's not going to be anybody coming. So that's going to affect food services if it's able to open. So in terms of options, we could continue subsidizing the operation. And as you can see, it's a very significant subsidy. We could reduce the subsidy by reducing student staffing. I'm talking about post-COVID when it opens up again. And relying on vendor-sourced food. In other words, no longer producing our own food in-house. Or we could outsource the operation. which a number of colleges have done. So those are some options. Wellness program, or the wellness center. This is a different thing. Food service, everything in food services is, all the revenue there comes from what food services does directly, from selling food directly. The wellness center is a bit different. What you see here is user fee revenues, over $200,000 a year initially. And now, as you can see, it's been declining the last few years, which makes sense because it ties to enrollment. Once again, back to enrollment having a major impact. There's a standard, I think it's a $1.25 fee students pay. I think it's per credit, if I'm not mistaken. And then, we as employees may also pay and that type of thing. But the point is that this is only part of the picture. The other part of the picture is that student government funds the Wellness Center. So student government, in the form of S&A fees, is contributing to the Wellness Center's revenues. And this is a decision they need to make every single year. And their revenue base is shrinking as well, the student governments. So if you add up the subsidy from S&A and the revenues from fees, you'll see that from a peak of about $300,000 in revenue in 2015-16, now we're looking at a very significant decline in revenues for the Wellness Center. And for a period of time there, expenses kept going up, but more recently they've been going down. So you'll see there was a surplus, though, because initially revenues were exceeding expenses by quite a bit. And then they kind of went through some adjustments and so on. Whoops, sorry. So cumulatively, over time, the Wellness Center has actually done okay. It's done pretty darn well. And it's not in difficulty at this moment. That said, it is student fee funded. So if the trends continue, things become more problematic. As you can see, the S&A subsidy authorization in 2018-19 was $130,000, but that's been declining. It's only $102,000 for this coming year. So almost $20,000 less than last year and almost $30,000 less than the 2 years before that. There is no provision right now for equipment replacement in the Wellness Center. So one of the things they need to think about going forward with their budgeting is, okay, we maybe have a slight surplus now, but when time comes to replace all the equipment, they may not have enough money to do it. And there's significant issues with the building itself, the roof leaks, et cetera. So there's some major expenses coming down the road. And right now, structurally, they don't have a pot of money set aside that's large enough to handle all those things. So they need to, in spite of the fact that they've got, sort of a positive situation right now, they need to begin factoring in that future and figuring out how to balance things out in that future. Now, that said, there's a post-COVID upside when for the Wellness Center, because fully expect enrollments to go up after COVID, sadly, because unemployment's going to be up a lot. So that will boost their revenue picture and perhaps start returning to them closer to where they were before. So they have several options as they look, forward. They could increase the fee, not that that's necessarily needed, and there's a whole process to go through. So Mary, did you want to share something on that score?
Oh, yes, that would be the plan, is that we would have to look at how we would market it, and then also allowing more community members to use the center. So there's talk of that. And Lorraine's been really good at looking into things.
Yeah. So another option is to seek grants and donations. So they have some fairly good flexibility and options. So I'm going to move on to childcare, which is a similar setup to the Wellness Center. So in terms of revenues, this is the user fees. So this is what the parents pay to have their children in the child care center. And childcare also receives a subsidy from S&A fees, which is, you know, as you can see, quite, whoopsie daisy. Seem to have vanished everything. What did I do? Oh, that's what I did. Sorry. So bear with me here. So as you can see, the subsidy from S&A is significant. It's been pretty consistent, and it's very helpful. And that's because students are the primary beneficiaries of the child care center, although some employees take advantage as well. So if you add up the two revenue sources together, as you can see, they've been fairly stable over time. And the expenses have generally exceeded those total revenues. When I say generally, all the time, but relative to, say, food service, it's a fairly small difference. So you see the losses, they were steepest in 17, 18, and now this year, even though we had COVID, it's relatively small, around $40,000. Cumulatively, it does add up though over time, right? Over those 6 years, it's a little shy of $300,000. So childcare, oh, I scribbled on there. I don't know how I did that. Had its origins when we had a early childhood development program. You know, that sort of helped get it started. There was an academic tie. There no longer is that tie, but it's very much student and employee focused, and it's about access and equity. Because of course, if you don't have a place to keep your children while you're trying to go to school, or maybe you're trying to work, that denies you something. So access and equity is very much a part of the child care center. And there are opportunities to serve the community as well, but our focus has been on students and employees. As you can see, the S&A subsidy in 1920 was only $156,000. In 2021, it's $184,000. So that actually has been increased for this coming year by the students. There is a limit to how, you know, if you think about businesses, in scaling businesses, and I'm looking at this as a business right now, efficiency is one of the things that you always think of. Well, how can we make things more efficient, produce more with less? That's not really operative in this case, because there are legal requirements around how many caregivers you have to a child, and we have to follow those and we have to meet those. However, we are priced below market, and that represents two things. One is it represents this access and equity concept. I mean, there's part of, you know, that's part of the thinking behind that. But it also reflects the fact that we really haven't gone after the community. And so we have some ability to bring in some community members and serve the community in a way we haven't before. So that's an opportunity. Currently, $27,000 a month that it's costing to sort of keep everyone on, which is very similar to the food service number. So just like with food service, COVID's going to decide, you know, sort of where things are. We can't serve the children right now because COVID makes that not possible. So from an options perspective, we can continue to subsidize the child care center. We can request more S&A support. And we can also increase prices and balance the budget. And I say we can do that because we are below market in pricing. So, and the amount we would need to raise it by to get there is, I think, within reach. There's a risk, just like with the wellness center and stuff, is when you're subsidized by S&A fees, you are dependent on the students' goodwill and decisions, for one, and also the resources the students have available. Because, correct me if I'm mistaken, Mary, but this year, or this coming year, the students' budget will actually be in a slight deficit, which is okay because they have some fund balances built up, but it's not a sustainable situation. So there's a little bit of a risk there. So that's sort of the basic childcare. Another option is to outsource the operation or to close the program. These are just kinds of pictures. So events and rentals. I just want to say something up front with events and rentals. This, we talk about, or I have talked about before, how our systems are problematic. These are the numbers out of our systems, and I will say the timing seems off, or I know the timing's off because there were some late invoices and stuff, and it's just what it is. So from a revenue perspective, as you can see, it's been around a little less than $300,000, with this huge bump in 1920, which doesn't really make any sense because we shut down for COVID and held less events. But it's also true that there were some very delayed billings from previous years that got into 1920. And I want to thank Hasna because she identified those non-billed invoices, and amazingly enough, she was actually able to collect on all those late invoices, which were going back 2 years. So pretty great. On the expense side, the expenses are much lower overall than the revenues, and I'll get into why that is in a bit. So it's all positive every year, and cumulatively, it's quite a significant upside. So a little bit about events and rentals. The first thing is it includes non-event revenues. So the Skybridge is being built, and a construction company has taken over part of the parking lot. Well, they're paying us $5,000 a month for that. So that's a good chunk of change. That's $60,000 a year that. We don't have to do anything for, really. It's also true that when a large event runs out the wellness center, we record that under events and rentals. And the cable TV, I think it's called cable TV, SCCC TV, they rent a studio from us. And so that's, not really an event, but it's just a space that we have and provide them. And that's almost $30,000 a year. So we've got almost $100,000 a year in revenues that really aren't related to events. Events serves two sets of constituents. First is the college's internal needs, and events does not bill for that. So when you get your furniture moved and changed and set up and all that work, college, none of your departments pay for that, even though there's an expense in the events and rentals budget. We only bill external clients, and so those are conferences coming to campus, people using the rooms, et cetera. So there's a positive fund balance, as you saw. Currently, we can't hold any events on campus, and it's costing us about $7,500 a month to continue staffing the department. So, like food services, like childcare, COVID decides when we can begin offering this service again, really, as a practical matter. Until COVID abates, we really have no control and no options. So basic options are to, ride it out and hope COVID ends sooner rather than later, or to shut down, which COVID's already shut us down in a way, and then reconstitute the operation when COVID allows us to. So the testing center, this is something which we charge students for testing fees. And as you can see, those fees have steadily increased over the years until this year, which once again, COVID shut down, no testing, or very limited testing. And as you can see, that budget has been more or less in break even until quite recently, and that I think is because we began to load some staff onto there, and then the revenues didn't do what we expected them to do. So we had basically a break-even operation for a while, and now we're running into a deficit situation. with a relatively modest cumulative deficit, but definitely not something we want to continue with. So there's no explanatory slide here because I have no idea what goes on in there, but it is an area that we're going to be looking at. So transportation services is another, and the final one here that I'm going to go through. So that is our parking, Orca passes, alternative transit, all that stuff. And so you can see the revenue has been pretty variable. And to be honest with you, I don't know why 17-18 was so high. It may have been a one-time payment or something. One of the anomalies around this is that, should I put this? This, once again, is one of those things where money is exchanging back and forth with the district. So we collect permit revenues and everything, and it goes straight to the district, and then the district remits what they don't use to us. And sometimes that's done like clockwork on the year, and sometimes the timing is messed up and they don't give us the money back, and then it all comes back in 1 year. And so I didn't manage to unpack that timing thing here, but I'm pretty sure that's why 17-18 is so high. You'll see that 19-20 has gone up even though we've been shut down, and that's because rates got increased in 19-20. As you can see, expenses have also been increasing. And so although from 14-15 to 17-18, we were continually in surplus, in 18-19, there was a loss, got a little smaller in 19-20. I would say that if we had not been shut down for COVID, we would not have had a loss in 19-20. In total, because of the surpluses of the previous years, there's a positive situation there associated with transportation services cumulatively. Now, just a little context. It's, again, parking and alternative transit. The alternative transit, we do receive revenues through the Transportation Management Plan subsidy, which is basically a fee that's assessed on students and so on. So we receive that money. And that's so that we can support discounted Orca passes and that type of thing. So, but it's not enough. So the parking fees subsidize Orca. And so this is something where it's this balance that they're trying to strike between making parking accessible, but encouraging alternative transit. So subsidizing alternative transit with parking fees to make alternative transit more and more attractive, but trying not to raise parking so much that somehow you begin to limit access in a way that's inequitable. So it's a balancing act they have to go through here. Security is part of the package of transportation services. So transportation services pays for some of our security staff. I would say above and beyond just patrolling the lots. The pricing right now is below market. So significantly below market is what people pay. And 2 years ago, I believe, they went to the board of trustees and asked for authority to raise prices and received it to do it in stages. And this coming year, there's a authorization to do it again. And the intent is to follow through on that authorization. Parking services or transportation services has taken a very minimalist approach to enforcement. So minimalist to me means that they patrol and ticket on a very limited basis. And the effect of that is that people who park without permits don't get caught, and that word gets around, and people don't buy permits. So we have a lot of people parking who do not buy permits, and if we did enforce more aggressively, they would buy permits. So the outlook here, same as food services, same as events, same as childcare. COVID is going to decide, because if we don't have anybody, parking, well, no parking revenue. We have a major cost coming forward. Several of the lots need resurfacing, and so the amount of revenue we've had so far will not cover the cost of resurfacing the lots. That said, light rail is really going to change the game. Come fall of 2021, the light rail station across the way will be accessible by pedestrian bridge. And if you look at parking in that area, there isn't enough. So we expect to become a park and ride location for light rail, and we will be able to, generate a lot more revenue because we'll be able to charge for that. So options for transportation services to handle their longer run break-even situation, which means that they have to, maintain the facilities in better condition than they are now, et cetera, are first of all to improve enforcement to increase permit purchases. So they have plans in place right now to do that because they're going to acquire what they call LPR, license plate recognition system. And that's basically a camera where to enforce, you drive around a lot and take pictures of people's license plates. And the license plate of a person serves as their permit. So you take a picture of the license plate with the camera. It's sort of automated. And if the license plate is in the database, great, no problem. If the license plate isn't in the database of people who have paid for permit parking, they get issued a ticket. And the goal here is not to get a lot of money from parking tickets. The goal is to make people buy permits and for everybody to be treated equally, as it were. The other option I told you about earlier is to increase parking rates, and that is part of the plan right now. Parking rates for the public at large and for students. And within doing that, one of the things that has to be sorted out and thought through is how we're going to address equity issues, because we will still be below market, but parking costs add up. So that is an overview of self-support. Next week, we're going to talk about where else the money goes. So I'll open up the floor for questions at this point. Crap, what do they do? Stop sharing here. Forgive me for I am in transition on too many screens.
So everyone was muted during the presentation, but if you would like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. You should be able to.
This is Jim Jewell, and I have a general question about this way that we are looking at some of these programs. To what degree are we engaging in the systems thinking that also looks at the differing impacts each of these programs has on enrollment? For example, I just started with food services because that's easy. I think we know if we had absolutely zero food services on campus, that would affect enrollment. And we want to have somewhat more than that. So how are we approaching that for each of these siloed areas that we're looking at, and we're looking at the money that they bring in or the deficit, but there's also different impacts on enrollment. So how is that being factored in?
Well, I think it's fair to say that in the case of food services, it hasn't been factored in yet. And there's some decisions that we are making as a campus. And then there's some decisions being made at the district level, and the district is driving the train on the bus, I guess, on food services.
One of the, this is Pete, one of the, in the past, several times, relative specifically to food services, we've tried to determine the impact of food services, having food on campus relative to enrollment. Is it a draw for students? Does it keep students on campus? And we have tried that through surveys, and we haven't done one. I can't remember the last time we did it, but the problem that we face with that is that we hear from students and staff, frankly, that they need and will use food services when if offered. And then we also get suggestions on types of food or other things that they would want to see. But then as that plays out over the next year or two, we don't see a change in the economic situation. So we have tried to quantify and we have tried to determine whether or not food services impacts enrollment. And we continue to get that disconnect between hearing, yes, I come to North in part because there's food, but not seeing that at the register.
This is Stephanie Dykes. I just wanted to add some observations to the conversation about food services. So having been here now a little over 5 years, I remember when we had just huge international enrollment, and I remember eating lunch in the Grove and just hearing every language spoken imaginable. So when I think about all of the factors that impact budget surpluses or losses in food services, I think there's a number of factors that would impact that. What has driven declines in international enrollment and then subsequently declines in revenue for food services, that's not really related to whether or not we offer food services. And to Pete's point, I think we'd have a hard time quantifying what the impact of food services on enrollment would be. When I think about possible reasons why someone selects North Seattle College or any other community college, I think of things like location and programs offered and reputation. So, and again, I don't want to seem dismissive of the need for students, especially students who don't have much money, to have access to a food source. But I've been here at North long enough to have taken part in some surveys conducted by food services. And, I heard comments on some of those surveys to the effect that, well, food services pricing is, overpriced relative to the market. I know that food services has tried lots of ideas in terms of, things like locally sourced and organic food. But, apparently those are just not reflected in the revenue. And I think, unfortunately, we're just living in a time when we do have to take a look at cost. And, the other side of the coin is when I think about reasons why students would stop attending North, it's probably things primarily like their grades were not sufficient, or they had an issue paying the tuition, or there was a family emergency. I think it would be a stretch to say that students decide not to attend because they can't get a hot lunch at North. So
I'm sorry, wait, my question has been completely derailed by my example of food services, and I'm going to apologize for that. My point was not to open up the question about food services because everything that's said is correct. What I'd like to know is, given that we just looked at a demonstration of all these different areas that are siloed, and we looked at them in terms of revenue and deficit, but without any connection to enrollment, I don't want to focus on food services, but I'd like to see that for transportation and for childcare, because that continually came up in the comments, that none of these is only about food or childcare or parking, but they do holistically connect to enrollment. And retention is a big issue, because we talk to students every day who complain about all of these different issues. So it's not about any one of those factors, My question is, what level of systems thinking are we doing to connect enrollment to each of these individual factors as we're looking at them? I'm not looking for a definitive number on food services. That is just going down a rabbit hole. It's much more the bigger question of how are we connecting services that we are looking at disconnected from enrollment, but we know have some impact on it. So I don't want to get into food services specifically. This is a broader question.
Yeah,
So,
thanks for thanks for clarifying that, Jim. Again, I think it would be a challenge to measure the kind of things you want to measure, but I'd be willing to to offer whatever services institutional effectiveness can regarding that. I don't know that we have the level of analytical capability in the district to measure that, but thank you again for clarifying your point.
So Jim, let me just say this: the process, the budget consultation process, is actually designed to get at that. So when budget managers of each area are putting together their budget proposals, when they talk about potential reductions or changes, part of the template, for want of a better word, they've been given is to say, okay, what are the effects of these changes going to be? What are the effects? What are the downsides? What are the risks? What are the trade-offs that have to be considered? So for every change proposed, there's that assessment should take place. And so part of that assessment, it's up to each individual manager, of course, of an area, is to say, okay, well, this is how I think this affects XYZ. And one of those XYZ things will definitely be enrollment in many cases. And so when all these things come together, because it's not in isolation, right? It wouldn't be just one or just, this, that. It's going to be a lot of things coming together and being presented to the Budget Advisory Committee. And part of their job is to try to sift through and come up with some, make some judgments, as it were. They don't make the ultimate decision, but they do make recommendations and of things that need to be taken into consideration. So the process will get at that. I can't tell you independently that kind of analysis is being done individually for any given thing, but I can say that the process is designed to bring that forth.
Hey, this is Jeff Young talking. I wanted to make a few comments about the parking. We have and will continue to have a very compassionate approach to enforcement. We often forgive first-time offenders if they go get a permit, or at least significantly reduce the parking ticket. For multiple offenders, we arrange payment plans and also reduce the total amount due. And we will continue to do that. The park and ride concept, we will not be below market on that. We will be, competitive, but we will, match like what they do down at UW, where they have a huge park and ride. It's basically their parking lots, but they have become a de facto park and ride, and that would be at a significantly higher rate to what our students would be paying for a daily permit and that kind of stuff. So, and it will subsidize from that point on, hopefully, if our projections are even close, and keep us able to have a very below market, but still, competitive rate for students and staff and that sort of thing. So we're seizing this opportunity, but like I said, we will continue to be very compassionate in dealing with our community.
I just wanted to interject, from my perspective as somebody who, has parked on campus, and as well as somebody who has used the wellness center. I think the prices that we pay are, unreal cheap. And again, I don't want to minimize the equity issues, but I think there's room to raise those rates, certainly for, for folks who, who are in administration. And I don't want to, put an extra bill into the budgets of other folks, but I think it's certainly something that needs to be looked at. And one other thing that struck me about Terrence's presentation, a recurring theme was COVID kind of decides what the action's going to be. And, until we can be safely back on campus, it's kind of hard to imagine that we're going to have, lots of revenue from either the wellness center or from parking. So, I hate to kind of, be the Debbie Downer on that, but I think COVID's going to be around for a while.
Hi, this is Trish Root. I was just wondering if there is any new information about funding now that we no longer have our own foundation and we're going through the district. Are there any answers that way with respect to fundraising?
I'm afraid I can't speak to that. I do know that the foundation continues to support all the colleges, so there are undoubtedly some opportunities there. Ann Richardson, maybe you can speak to it.
Hi. Well, I work with the foundation minimally, but their fundraising is, I believe, at the same level or more than it was when they were located at North. And I know that they're working on, on increasing those efforts. But typically, it's hard to raise money for deficit projects. Most funders want to fund new and innovative concepts. So that's about all I can say.
You use the right word, projects. This is Shameen Crawford. The foundation, of course, is working on raising money for projects and initiatives, but not to help the colleges balance their budgets per se, because those are ongoing expenses that we never want to tie to a foundation per se in their fundraising.
Well, we seem to have come to the 2 minutes to the end of our hour. Just want to give anybody a last opportunity before we close out.
If I may say, I want to speak back to what Jim brought to the forefront. And Jim, know that I heard that, we hear that, and that will be recommended to the back budget advisory committee, that we actually use the tool of enrollment and what that looks like. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront. And then also I'm pasting to, I believe Dr. Chris, you asked for the guiding principles of the budget advisory committee and things of that. I'll paste that in the chat, but then we can also send that out as a budget advisory committee to let you all know our guiding principles and our priorities too as well. I think that's useful for everyone to have.
I know we're just ending, but I wanted to mention something on testing. I'm an advisor, and I hear over and over, and I'm sure other people on this call do too, that students don't have the money to pay for tests. But they're relying on financial aid to pay tuition and basic needs, then that is often a barrier, and that's a barrier to enrollment as well. And so I just wanted to bring that up. I know there's some different models out there for how to fund testing, and maybe that's something that can be considered in this situation.
I think one of the things that, for good or for bad, this whole crisis is compelling all of us to think outside the box. And perhaps there are some new models that will come out of this and new approaches. I know everybody is working super hard to reimagine and to be innovative and to be creative and to look at this as, as an opportunity as much as it is a firefighting, you know. Well, we have hit the noon hour. Appreciate everybody joining. Hopefully you're finding these informative. I'm certainly learning a lot through the discussion, and look forward to next week. Thank you.
Thank you.